It's a real challenge here to be the last speaker, and I want to thank all of you for sticking around. This is going to be something different, I think, from other talks for a couple reasons. One, it's going to be very conceptual, and for another thing, I'm going to be addressing questions about not how population processes and structure affects the genetics of populations, but rather I'm going to be using some of the methods that I think you learned in your school, for those of you who are in the school, to try to understand how evolution impacts population dynamics. Okay, so that's going to be the focus of my talk. And I'm going to focus in on a classical question of ecology, which is how are communities assembled? And I'm going to address the question of how evolution might contribute to that process of community assembly. This is Mount St. Helens, which is a volcano that's situated not too far from where I come from in the United States. And about 25 years ago, it blew its top off and devastated the landscape. 25 years later, you can see that all the organisms that were eliminated were replaced by a community of plants. These are lupins, there's insects in there, there's soil microbes, and there's also mammals have come back. So the question is, how do you go from this empty habitat, a very harsh habitat at that, to a state like this? So that's the basic issue, at least from my standpoint as a kind of an ecologically naive evolutionary geneticist, is how could evolution impact this transition? Okay, ecologists are very interested in community assembly. It's important for a variety of reasons, including conservation biology, predicting how species and communities are going to respond to climate change, and so on and so forth. And basically, ecologists think of community assembly as a historical process that evolves sampling species from some regional pool, and then that pool that ends up forming the community is impacted by colonization through immigration, maybe speciation on site, and local extinctions. Okay, that's over the long time scale, but on shorter time scales, you can think of communities as being derived from subsets of regional species pools that pass through a set of filters here. And this is a figure from a paper a few years ago that describes filters that are provided by migration limitation, the fit between organisms in their abiotic environments, interactions with other species, and so forth. So they use this metaphor of filters, and basically what I want to do today is try to unpack the metaphor. How are these different filters, the random sampling, of the dispersal, fit with the environment, how could those be affected by evolution? Okay. So it's known that community assembly basically involves three categories of processes. Okay, the first is the actual establishment, the successful colonization of empty habitat like that volcano, and the establishment of self-sustaining populations. So this is sometimes called naturalization. Okay, once you have self-sustaining populations, they might diversify evolutionarily, and that leads to different species with different characteristics, driven by character displacement, for example, or evolutionary chases, arms races, and so forth. These established populations can also change in their relative abundances, and that affects the kinds of communities that you get. And then when you go out to the landscape context, you consider the flows of individuals that can change competitive balances locally, provide resources that aren't there locally, and so forth. So this is kind of a general overview of the process, the processes by which communities are assembled. Now, keep this ecological framework in mind, and now I want to couple that with a more recent phenomena, and the recent phenomena is something called rapid evolution. Rapid evolution is, at a basic sense, evolutionary change that occurs on the same time scale as population dynamics. And this notion of rapid evolution was really promoted by Nelson Hairston Jr. and Steve Elner, who did some experimental evolution studies. I think it was using Chlamydomonas. And what they showed is that if you did not account for evolution in these populations, then you would get really different population cycles coming out. And so they showed in this experimental work that evolution could be a very strong driver of population dynamics. Okay? And this then led to a big enthusiasm amongst ecologists who started to think that evolution and rapid evolution was rampant, and that in fact you could not make proper predictions about any ecological process unless you included a consideration of evolution. Okay? So, and if we apply this to this issue of community assembly, then you might wonder if rapid evolution could impact the establishment of naturalized populations, diversification, and so forth. All right? So thinking about evolution in each of these contexts is a huge problem. Okay? And I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'm going to focus in just on the very first process here, which is how might evolution affect the establishment of self-sustaining populations, naturalized populations. And I'm going to even narrow it down a little bit further by thinking about kind of very infrequent colonization events, almost like the ecological equivalent of strong selection, weak mutation, where you get a sweep to fixation before the next mutation arises. Here I'm thinking of you get a colonization or a failure to colonize before you get the next colonizing group coming in. And the question then is, how might rapid evolution impact the probability of successful establishment? Okay? So even though we know that evolution can affect ecological dynamics, I'm looking at the question more generally of, which is how strong are those effects? How often do we need to worry about those evolutionary effects when we're trying to understand this very ecological process? And I'll be using a theoretical approach here, okay? So the establishment, you can kind of divide up the way you think about it in this way. First of all, you can just think about different species, when they're entering a community, establish or not independently of one another. Okay? In that case, the effect of evolution will be direct on the fit of that organism with its environment. But then once you have species that have successfully established, then subsequent species coming in are going to face not only the abiotic environment, but also changes to the biotic environment, because now there's resident species. So in the same sense, evolution might have an effect, or coevolution between resident and invader species might have an effect on establishment. And I'll talk about that. But what I'm also going to emphasize is what I'll call indirect evolutionary effects, that these are evolution, the effect of pre-evolution in the residents on the subsequent establishment success of species that might come in later. Okay? So this is essentially an outline of the rest of my talk, how I'm going to think about the possible role of evolution in the establishment of new species in a community. Okay. So let's start with independent invasions. So think of this as establishment of species in habitat that's empty of other species. And one way to kind of just set your mind is think back to the MacArthur and Wilson equilibrium theory of island biogeography, and basically they assume that every species that came in had the same constant probability of establishment, okay? And they just set there to be some parameter C. They didn't have any explicit population dynamics, and obviously no evolution either. But the question is, what are these probabilities of establishment, number one, and how are they influenced by the environment? And number two, how could those probabilities of establishment be affected by evolution? So if you think about it in just kind of a crude sense, one way to characterize the likely success or failure of a new colonizing group in an environment is its initial intrinsic rate of increase. So this is this figure showing some examples of population trajectories of colonizing groups with different initial growth rates when they first show up in some habitat. So if you start with the panel up here, this is a colonizing group that starts with a very, very high intrinsic rate of increase. And over a short number of generations, if you follow this dashed line here, you can see that they grow just fine and establish with no problem. And contrast that with the lower right-hand corner here. This is a colonizing group that has a strongly negative intrinsic rate of increase. This is a very harsh environment from its standpoint. And the dashed line here shows the population dynamics that quickly goes extinct. So the solid lines here in these two cases show what happens if we assume a model of adaptive evolution given that same initial intrinsic rate of increase. So in this case, a population that starts with a high initial rate, intrinsic rate of increase, and it adapts evolutionarily, it gets an even higher rate of increase, and so it grows to large population size quickly. So the evolution, though, doesn't really have much impact on the probability of establishment. It was going to establish just fine without the evolution. Okay? Down here, in this very harsh environment, this curve up, or this trajectory here, corresponds to a case where you have adaptive evolution as well. The growth rates are still negative, but they're not as negative as they were. The problem is they are negative, and so in this case, adaptive evolution does not prevent extinction. So in this situation, you would go extinct, a colonizing group goes extinct without evolution, and it goes extinct with evolution. Okay, so evolution doesn't make an impact here or here in any real sense. But what about populations that have a somewhat positive, but not largely positive, intrinsic rate of increase? Well, the lower curve here shows that persistence, even with a positive intrinsic rate of increase, is not assured. And here's an example trajectory of a colonizing group that kind of fluctuates around and then goes extinct. Here's the same population, but one now that can adapt evolutionarily, and you can see that that evolutionary advantage causes persistence. And the question one of the questions I'm going to look at is, how often does this evolutionary change allow these populations that are kind of on the edge of persistence to persist more readily? Similarly, if we have a mildly negative harsh environment, that is, populations are declining, but they're declining slowly, without evolution, they go extinct pretty quickly, but with evolution, there's a possibility that they could persist if they can adapt quickly enough. So the places where we look for evolution to have an impact on establishment success are these situations where populations are growing relatively slowly, deterministically, or declining relatively slowly. And the question is, how big is that impact? So I guess this is just saying what I mentioned. If you have a positive growth rate, you establish. It's not certain. If it's negative, you never establish. But if you can include adaptive evolution, then that establishment probability might be raised, but by how much? And if you have a slightly negative growth rate, you have the potential to persist, but is it very significant? So here's some simple simulations that I did to explore those issues. So on the x-axis here is the initial intrinsic rate of increase of a bunch of replicate colonizing groups, all starting with 10 individuals. So to the left corresponds to these very negative, these harsh environments, so you have a very negative growth rate. And over to the right, you have a highly positive growth rate, okay? Then what I'm plotting on this axis is the probability that these colonizing propagules will persist for 100 generations, okay? I did this, just a simple program in R. So if you look at the curve here with the little open circles, this corresponds to what to populations that are genetically identical. Okay, there's no evolution, and so this is the probability of establishment of populations with very negative growth rates, and it's basically 0. And over here on the right, you can see that populations with highly positive intrinsic rates of increase have a high probability of establishment, right? The curve on the top here is an otherwise identical population, but it has genetic variation for the growth rate, okay? In this case, I used an asexual model, so there's 2 types. So you allow adaptive evolution, but from the same initial intrinsic rate of increase. So this upper curve then describes how evolution affects the probability of establishment from really harsh environments up to very benign environments. And so you can think of the area between these 2 curves as kind of depicting the impact of evolution on the probability of establishment of these new colonizing groups. And what you can see from this figure very easily, which echoes what I mentioned before, is that when you're in very harsh or highly benign environments, the impact of evolution on the probability of establishment is extremely small. But if you look at these intermediate ranges where the growth rates are near 0, evolution can have a pretty big impact, okay? So evolution can have an impact on establishment probability, but it's pretty restricted to where it operates and has a significant impact. And one other thing, or another way to look at this same sort of simulation data is you can think of how many colonizing attempts would you need until you get the first successful establishment. And that's what I'm showing over here. Again, this is showing the initial intrinsic rate of increase on the x-axis, and then the number of colonizing attempts till you get the first success on the y-axis. So without any evolution, that's the curve right here, you can see that in very benign environments, it doesn't take more than 1, maybe 2 colonizing attempts to be success. But then once you get down to 0, you basically have no chance of success. But if you include evolution in that colonizing group, then you can see that there's a number of situations where you go from no possibility of colonization to some possibility of colonization. And in fact, the impact, one other point I want to make is that the impact of evolution is skewed towards making populations that have slightly negative growth rates have a possibility of persisting, whereas those that are just slightly positive, it has a definite benefit to the probability of establishment, but it's not as dramatic as what happens to those populations that are in decline. Yeah, question? No, it's standing genetic variation. Sorry about that. I know just about everything else had, but you can run these things with mutation if you want. Okay, so just to repeat everything, to write down everything I said, adaptive evolution definitely increases the odds of success, but it only has a significant impact for intrinsic growth rates that are close to slow growth or slow decline. It's somewhat more important for propagules that are in slow decline because it makes a certain event, which is certain extinction without evolution, become a possible event, a possible establishment. And of course, I showed you a super simple set of results for clones with standing variation. Clearly, the quantitative details about how the genetics and evolution impacts the probability of success is going to depend on all those genetic details as well. But the qualitative picture remains the same. Okay, so let's say now that in our community we have a species that's successfully established, and evolution may or may not have contributed to that. The question is, how do we build on that community? How do other species join the community, and how does evolution affect that? Well, there's a number of different relationships that an invader can have with a resident. It can either be a consumer of the resident species, a resource, competitor, and so forth. So if we want to make some general statements about how evolution can impact this second phase of community assembly, then we might want to consider all these types of ecological interactions. But this leads to extra evolutionary considerations, because not only can the invader species evolve, but the resident can as well. So we want to now consider possibly the evolution of one or both of these species on the establishment probability of a colonizing group. So to take a look at this, postdoc of mine, Emily Jones, and I put together a real simple model with two species, interacting species, a resident, an invader, I for invader, R for resident. We used modified versions of Lotka-Volterra equations. So these are just off-the-shelf sort of equations. And what we did is we made a different Lotka-Volterra equation for each clonal genotype. So this is showing a clonal model. And each, the invader and the resident species could have, I think we mostly focused on just two clones. The key part of this equation, the interaction, is in this term over here, beta. Genetic variation in one or the other species could affect the strength of the interaction between the species and subsequently impact the probability of establishment of this invader. So what we did is we solved these differential equations with different assumptions for these mutualists, predator-prey, competitors, and so forth. And then we turned the population dynamics into a probability of establishment using kind of a crude method of thinking of Poisson distribution of descendants. And so you basically use the probability that at least one descendant's present given this number of individuals. It's pretty hokey, but it gives us an analytic result that actually matches up pretty well with individual base simulations that we did along with this. Okay. Again, we're aiming here for qualitative predictions, trying to understand how evolution might impact the additional assembly of communities with resident species already in place. So here's a figure that describes a couple of general patterns that we found. So on this axis is kind of what you might call the background interaction strength. So this is that interaction term that was in the Lotka-Volterra equation that tells how one species affects positively or negatively the population dynamics of the other species. The genetic variation in here led to a difference in the interaction strength of one of the genotypes. So, but that was modifying the baseline rate. This figure is showing how the probability of establishment or persistence depends on the background strength of the interaction for either a mutualist or a predator invader. Okay, so in other words, an invader that benefits from its interactions with the resident species. So we used a simple matching genotypes model here. And so if you have both resident and invader species genetically uniform, they can be fixed matched or fixed mismatched. And so that's what the dotted curve and the solid curve here are showing, those probabilities of establishment for those two cases with no evolution. So cases where you do have genetic variation have to fall somewhere in between. So what this figure shows is that when you have very strong interactions, that is, the invader gets a lot of resources from the resident mutualist or prey species, that its establishment probability is high, and evolution doesn't really have much scope for making it higher. And if the invader coming in doesn't get much benefit, then evolution isn't going to give it much more benefit. So it's only these intermediate interaction strengths where evolution could make a difference at all. Okay? You get the same sort of story when the invader is negatively impacted by the resident species because it's preyed upon or it's a competitor. Okay? The same story holds in that it's only when you have interaction strengths between the species of intermediate strength that evolution can make a difference. Otherwise, evolution doesn't really contribute positively or negative to that establishment probability. We looked at this more broadly. We used our mathematical models as essentially a controlled experimental system where we either had neither species capable of evolving, only the resident species capable of evolving, the invader evolving, or both. And we tried to look at the different impacts of these evolutionary events. So if you look at the first column here, this is showing how whether evolution increased or decreased the establishment probability compared to an equivalent ecological model with no genetic variation. So in the first case, this is showing the establishment, how evolution enhanced or decreased the establishment probability of a predator invader for different interaction strengths. So that's what's on the x-axis. And so what you can see over a broad range of interaction strengths, evolution didn't affect the establishment probability of all compared to what would happen in the absence of evolution, but at these intermediate strengths, it increases the probability of establishment. You get the same story with other kinds of invaders. In all cases, the evolution of the invader species increases its probability of establishment compared to the case where it couldn't evolve. What happens, though, if the invader species is genetically monomorphic, but the resident species can evolve in response to that invader species? That's what's shown here in the middle column. And in the case where the invader is a predator, then the evolution in the resident prey species reduces the probability that that predator will invade because the prey species can evolve to get away from that predator, which makes it harder for the invader predator to evolve. But notice that only happens over a narrow range of interaction strengths. The same story holds for an incoming prey, because the resident predator becomes a more efficient predator. What's interesting here is down here, you can barely see it. If the resident species is a competitor of the invader, the resident evolution actually can increase the probability of that invader's, the invading competitor's probabilities of establishment. That seems a little counterintuitive until you realize that we're using a matching alleles model, and so the resident species actually evolves to move away from the invading species to minimize the competitive impacts. And that's why that actually opens up the slight possibility of a higher probability of establishment for this kind of interaction. Notice, however, that the impacts, positive or negative, when only the resident can evolve, are much, much smaller than when the invader can evolve. The basic reason for that is because selection is asymmetric. There's a lot more residents around to infect the invader than vice versa. Okay? That's just this isn't really a boundary. This is just where we cut off our. Well, this is, I should say, a narrow range of beta instead of intermediate beta. Okay. The point here is that evolution does not make, this is a flat line in just about every case, but a narrow band. Yeah, thank you for helping me clarify that. What's that? Time point? We just let these run out until there was either until things resolved. I think like 100 generations. Okay, but it really didn't. That time point only affects the quantity or the size of the effect, not a lot of these general features that I'm talking about right here. So it would affect the height of these. Oh, and by the way, you might be interested in why we have a whole distribution. That's because we started these genetically variable communities with all kinds of different initial pools of genetic variation. Okay. This last category here, by the way, is what happens if both resident and invader species can co-evolve. And you can see that you can basically put together the individual cases with just invader or resident evolution. Coevolution doesn't lead to any kind of different establishment dynamic effects. So anyway, that's that analysis. And I think I've described all these outcomes, so I don't think I'll belabor them by going over them again. I'm going to move right on to the question about what kinds of effects could evolution have if the residents evolved prior to the establishment or to the arrival of new species. So what are these indirect effects of evolution? And actually there's a beautiful example of this presented earlier today. This scenario of predator escape. So let's say that a predator and prey have been in residence together for a long time, and they've co-evolved adaptations and counter-adaptations to one another. And the predator or the prey moves to some isolated geographic area where the predator is now absent. Well, if those anti-predator traits involve costs, then that prey species in the absence of the predator will lose those anti-predator effects, right? Or anti-predator traits. Well, if somehow that predator is able to come over to the place where the prey has been evolving and losing those anti-predator effects, it's going to make it much easier for the predator to establish. So that's what I mean by an indirect evolutionary effects. Evolution that goes on in the absence of a potential invader can actually affect that invader's chances of successful establishment probability. Okay, so this can happen with larger communities that are co-evolving, and then potential species that can join it might be affected by the coevolutionary history of that community. And so it's less obvious, though, how that coevolutionary history could affect establishment probability. So to take a look at this issue in a really simplistic way, we developed some models of a co-evolving resident community, and we used our mathematical models, which I won't go into detail about just to save time, but I'm happy to talk with people about it later if you're interested in knowing how we set this up. We let these communities co-evolve for a number of generations, and then we imagined introducing a third invading species and address this question: how does the evolutionary history of this community affect the probability of establishment of this new species? Okay. Of course, there's a whole lot of different possibilities of communities and how they are related to potential invading species. And so to narrow things down, we looked at a specific case of interest that Darwin had actually considered. And it's a situation that's been called Darwin's naturalization conundrum. And what Darwin was thinking about was, how does the phylogenetic distance between an invading species and the resident species affect its probability of establishment? And he made a couple of arguments. He said, well, if the invading species is closely related to one of the resident species, then it probably has a lot of the same capabilities of utilizing the abiotic environment or exploiting a a prey in the a resident prey, or dealing with a mutualist. So that would suggest that the more closely related a species is to one of the species resident in the community, the higher its probability should be of establishment, and that should drop off as phylogenetic distance increases. On the other hand, closely related species probably tend to be competitors of one another. They share the same resources and so forth. So in that case, you would expect closely related species to actually be strong competitors with residents and probably lose because they're at a numerical disadvantage. That means that more distantly related species ought to establish more with higher probability. So he recognized that these were opposing arguments. He favored, though, the importance of this competitive effect of resident species with close relatives based on some evidence that some of his contemporaries had noticed. But this has been looked at much more recently. Ecologists have become very fascinated with what phylogenetic relationships and distance can say about the structure of ecological communities. And this is admittedly a pretty simple scenario, but Darwin actually tried to put some process on top of that sort of question. But what he didn't do was a rigorous mathematical analysis of it. So that's where we come in. We did actually a non-rigorous mathematical analysis, but it was an analysis. So we came up with a scenario where we have a couple of resident species that have been isolated for a while, and there's a species, this is the potential invader, that's related to one of the species, the bee species here, okay? And we considered what happens if we introduce this relative species into this co-evolving community at different points in time, keeping in mind that this species, because it's a relative of this, is going to be a competitor. So they're always competitors. This species and this species will share the same relationship as these two species. So we're looking at fairly short evolutionary time frames here. I want to emphasize that, okay? But if this conundrum is going to work out, it better work out on the short term, because in the long term it's going to be impossible to know what can happen. So we set up a coevolutionary model and looked at this idea. It turned out that it was very important how you modeled how species interactions resolve themselves into fitness for the two interacting species. Ecologists recognize a couple of categories of species interactions. One is you can think of as phenotype differences. So the fitnesses of two interacting species depend on which is, say, bigger than the other. If you think of gape size of a predator and body size of the prey, if the gape size is bigger than the size of the predator than the size of the prey, then the predator is going to win and the prey is going to lose. But if the body size of the prey is bigger than the gape size of the predator, then it can escape predation. So that's one kind of interaction resolution, and it can be applied to competitive interactions and mutualisms, like Darwin's the orchid and the hawk moth with the extreme proboscis length is an example of a mutualistic interaction that's governed by these differences. The alternate type is what's called phenotype matching, where the strength of the interaction is strongest, either positively or negatively, when the two interacting species match. And a good example of this would be nest parasites who lay eggs, that if they are similar to the host species' eggs in coloration, they will successfully parasitize that nest. But if the coloration is different at all, then their egg gets kicked out. Okay, so if you set up your model with these two different kinds of interactions, you get very different predictions about how phylogenetic distance between related residents, how their probabilities of establishment. And let's see if I can explain this figure to you. So what this is showing is how the evolutionary history of a community affects the probability that the relative species joins the community if compared to no coevolution. So if a dot appears above this line, that means that the coevolutionary history has increased the probability of establishment of a competitor invader in this case, or this is a competitor species, as a function of phylogenetic distance, which is on the x-axis here. So looking down these different sorts of communities, you can see that the related invader for phenotype matching sorts of interactions, if you wait long enough, tends to always have a higher probability of joining the community than if the community wasn't co-evolving. In contrast, on the right, you can see that if the interactions between species are governed by these phenotype differences, the lynx hair or the gape size, body size, then the coevolutionary history of the community always tends to make the probability of establishment of that related species lower than it would be in the absence of coevolution. So this is totally different from what Darwin predicted. What this says is that the relationship between phylogenetic distance between an invader and its relative in the community is mostly driven by the kinds of interactions that those species are having and how they're resolved ecologically, either through phenotype matching or phenotype differences. Yeah, question? So you're absolutely right that we assume in these models that the coevolution before the related resident arrives does drive phenotypic divergence, okay? But what's key here is with phenotype matching, the divergence doesn't keep going off into oblivion, it stops, okay? And so that's why the resident then, or the invader can also claim the benefits that its relative did. It's really different with phenotype differences because the divergence keeps going and going and going, and so the related invader is always on the losing end of the stick, both in its competitive interactions with its relative, but also with the other species that has been involved, the other resident species, if that makes sense. Okay, so I know I'm out of time here, so I'll just say that this shows that these indirect effects of evolution before an invader arrives, can actually be very substantial. Okay, and we can talk later about unrelated invaders if you want. I have some speculations there, but there's a lot more work to be done on this issue, certainly beyond this Darwin's conundrum. So to conclude, what I hope I've convinced you of is that adaptive evolution of invading species does enhance its establishment probability. It can promote or inhibit that, but the conditions under which evolution can have a substantial impact on that establishment part of the community assembly process seem to be, in a theoretical sense, quite narrow and limited, okay? And the last point is that these indirect effects of evolution that I talked about can actually be much more substantial and might be worthy of consideration. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I want to thank my collaborators here, Emily, Bob, and Scott, for their help with this. And thanks for staying awake, those of you who are awake, and thanks for a great conference.